The fall of 1998. After 2.5 years of development, Metal Gear Solid finally debuts for the Sony PlayStation. The world has never played a video game like it. MGS1, as it's known, will single-handedly redefine the form, arguably as the first game of the 21st century. MGS1 isn't just good, it's a new kind of good. And now, 20 years after its release, I will attempt to explain in detail why MGS1 remains an icon of game design, of human engineering, and of interactive storytelling, and why it's largely because of the game's refusal to follow established rules at the time, and its disciplined, meticulous manner of marrying together solidly practical programming with defiantly creative, if not downright unusual, conceptual design. Hi, I'm Joran.
What took you so long?
Kojima. My dream is to establish a new field in pop culture analysis called Kojima Studies. I'm basically a fanboy, but I do my best to temper my enthusiasm and try to stay more neutral. It isn't easy for me. Because I'm convinced that, well, video games have become the future, the present, and the past. Games are no longer up for debate, no longer brushed off as a passing fad. Because games are now the central mode of pop culture today, which is a claim that I'm going to spend this entire series fleshing out. But there's time for that. Time that I'll also spend explaining why I'm just as convinced that this Hideo Kojima guy deserves recognition as an important player in the story of how games went from a predominantly Japanese artistic and cultural export in the late 20th century to becoming what it is now in the early 21st. In this series of retrospectives, we'll revisit the events of the game, discuss its background, its impact, and the legacy it's left behind now, 20 years into existence. But let's begin with an introduction.
In December 1991, the Soviet Union came to an end. And in that year, the so-called Cold War between Moscow and Washington that began at the end of World War II underwent a historic transformation with the START Treaty. For the first time in history, the two superpowers agreed that year to significantly reduce nuclear weapons that could reach each other's soil, as well as the missiles, aircraft, and other means of delivering them.
In traditional animation, one observes motion and then draws to create the illusion of life. In this case, we're performing the motion, and the illusion of life comes with it. It's very exciting.
Like cartoons, video games are something many kids cannot seem to get enough of. To feed the demand, video game giants Nintendo and Sega continually try to outdo each other with new introductions of hardware and software. At stake, billions of dollars in this booming industry. Steve Baxter tells us about some of the latest shots fired in this duel.
November 1993. The 3D revolution in computer graphics is still in its infancy. In the Akihabara district of Tokyo, the lucrative arcade business has fostered extreme competition among Japanese game companies. Currently, the hit to beat is Capcom's Street Fighter. The Cold War ended less than 2 years ago. Many say the world has evolved beyond the horrors and divisions of the 20th century, beyond primitive tribalism and war. The prevailing ideal is a 21st century unified by technology, liberal democracy, capitalism, information, and digital communication. In America, the revolution in military affairs cuts defense spending through a doctrine of cost-effective technological superiority. Implementing this high-tech doctrine to keep the U.S. war machine alive in peacetime accelerates the development of virtual reality and combat simulation technology. With this gear, the military-industrial complex fights history's first ever virtual war.
DSD,
Distributed Interactive Simulation.
Distributed Simulation Technology,
The DIS Protocol.
SimNet,
CCTT.
the virtual world.
The Synthetic Environment.
Not only were soldiers in 1990 to 91's Operation Desert Storm extensively trained by DARPA's SimNet system, massive amounts of data compiled from the war itself provide models for future simulations. Thanks to what the press calls defense conversion, some of this state-of-the-art military-grade hardware finds its way into the hands of game developers. But that's nothing new. As Corey Mead writes, quote, "Advanced computing systems, computer graphics, the internet, multiplayer network systems, the 3D navigation of virtual environments, all these were funded by the Department of Defense." End quote. One inheritor of this American military technology is Tokyo's own Yu Suzuki, the single most important employee at Sega. Building off General Electric's military simulation hardware, last year Suzuki designed the Sega Model 1 arcade cabinet, one of the first 3D arcade boards ever made. But the biggest boss of the arcade at the time was the fighting game Street Fighter II, developed by Sega's rival, Capcom. Street Fighter illustrates why developers are skeptical whether 3D polygons can realistically depict human beings at the time. Virtua Racing only featured inanimate objects. A game depicting humans in 3D did not exist. To challenge the dominance of Capcom and of 2D, Suzuki designs the first ever fully 3D arcade fighting game. Virtua Fighter, which relies on a high-end graphics microprocessor designed by U.S. military contractor Lockheed Martin, will revolutionize fighting games and video games at large. Suzuki worked personally with martial arts masters in China before designing Virtua Fighter's character animations. The realism of this game is unlike anything the industry has ever seen. Virtua Fighter releases this year, 1993. Virtua Fighter is the future. The downside of being Yu Suzuki in 1993 is that as impressive as hits like Virtua Fighter are, the shelf life for arcade boards is short. As he will later say, quote, "We made hardware and then created games to fit. The total span from making the hardware to selling it was 1 year, so we were constantly working on a new CPU." End quote. But instead of putting the 3D real-time rendered polygons in arcade cabinets like Yu Suzuki, this new company, a new Tokyo-based subsidiary of a major consumer electronics corporation, has very different plans. When Metal Gear Solid debuted in 1998, it followed a period of explosive evolutionary growth across all types of digital technologies. The name this new wave in consumer electronics was given at the time was the multimedia revolution. Computers were no longer single drab boxes used for work alone in the public mind. They started to become whole systems, a new entire lifestyle and form of entertainment, built on totally new kinds at the time, of course, of audio-visual entertainment technology. That's when demand began to grow for a new kind of machine. The ultimate manifestation of this multimedia concept in games came in many forms, but it didn't reach full consolidation until, of course, the Sony PlayStation.
I'd like to talk to you about a menace, threatening humanity. It's happening right here, in our very homes, and corrupting the lives of our loved ones. Yes, friends, I'm talking about this. It may look like a harmless bagel toaster, but inside is a deadly donut. Remember, do not underestimate the power of PlayStation.
Arguably the greatest influence on the creation of 1998's Metal Gear Solid was the PlayStation console itself.
プレイステーションという、ハードの噂が聞こえてきまして、どうやらですね、家庭用で 3D ポリゴンが扱えると、もう当時で言うと夢のような話なんですけども、でそれを聞いた時に最初に浮かんだのがメタルギア。
SCE are hardly the only newcomers to Tokyo as of 1993. One other such newly established HQ there is by a company that's less inexperienced but no less ambitious. Back in Konami's former hometown of Kobe, it's around the same time of 1993, one of their rising star developers is given his first very own production team, called internally the Kaihatsu Gobu, or Development Section 5. That developer is Hideo Kojima. Many of the same team that now are hard at work to complete Policenauts will later work with him to make Metal Gear Solid. But development on MGS1 won't actually begin until 1996. Building off the visual novel adventure game format of Kojima's 1988 release, Snatcher, the first game by Kaihatsu Gobu is 1994's Policenauts. The game, a major achievement, will largely go unrecognized. Not only will Policenauts see several major overhauls and revisions as it's released and re-released again and again to keep up with all the new hardware formats being released during the mid-90s. Even more fatally for Policenauts' legacy, the game never officially released in the West. But the problems that Policenauts faced pale in comparison to those of the early planning phase for Metal Gear Solid. Hideo Kojima was finalizing the original PC-98 version of Policenauts when he learned the new Sony machine was going to be able to produce real-time 3D, like the kind found in arcades. It was more or less right away that Kojima conceived the idea of rebooting his very first game series, Metal Gear, as the first fully real-time 3D rendered action game for the Sony system. First, Kaihatsu Gobu graphic artist Yoji Shinkawa was given two assignments. As he was overseeing the direction of computer-generated 3D in the PlayStation remake of Policenauts, Shinkawa was also tasked with designing a prototype for the upcoming project's eponymous giant robot, Metal Gear. The earliest work on MGS1 produced the blueprint for what was to become known as Metal Gear Rex. Meanwhile, Kojima played around with 3D design by building a 50 cubic meter 3D simulation of a sniper's playground with the PlayStation's native dev tools. But right away, there were major problems. It was very early in planning for MGS1, while the team was several months deep in R&D, that disaster would strike.
In the early morning of January the 17th, 1995, instruments in a lab in Western Japan picked up a burst of intense electromagnetic radiation. It was the signature of a massive earthquake which had just struck the city of Kobe from its epicenter 20 kilometers to the southwest.
January 17th, 1995. The Great Hanshin earthquake, the worst in Japan's history, hits Kobe. Kaihatsu Gobu were relocated to Osaka. And in April of 1996, the project entered its next phase of development with the reformation of the Osaka-based Kaihatsu Gobu Group as the Tokyo-based semi-autonomous subsidiary called Konami Computer Entertainment Japan, or KCE Japan for short. The Konami Software Development Building is destroyed, and all of KCE Japan's progress goes with it. Devastated both professionally and personally in the disaster, KCE Japan would not have survived the struggle for existence during this period without the closeness of their bonds. But the earthquake would not end up being the last major setback that KCE Japan would face. Following the Hanshin quake, KCE Japan simply redoubled their efforts, only became more determined to see it through. Moving into the Ibizu building of Konami's HQ in Tokyo, KCE Japan adapted to the extreme adversity at the time by going back and rethinking fundamentals. To make development of MGS1 easier, the design concept needed to be simpler, and Kojima's team came up with the perfect tool for the job. Legos. They laid out the entire game map with real 3D solid shapes to provide MGS1 its signature sense of physical dimensionality. But that was just the beginning. With one problem solved, more loomed around the corner. The next major problem facing KCE Japan had to do with character animations. It was unknown if polygons could look as human or as expressive as the team needed them to. So, rather than turn to anyone from the film industry or anyone at Sony, KCE Japan actually turned to a specialist from the world of anime to give each of the game's characters the right mix of motions and gestures to feel just slightly cartoonish and larger than life. Here's how MGS1's real-time 3D sequences are put together. First, Kojima and the writing staff send in a scenario. This is handed to motion designer So Toyota, who then storyboards the scene and gets working on giving it motion. Then, KCE Japan use an in-house custom polygon animation tool called Polygonami. That's how they create the in-game models. After matching gestures to speech as written in the scenario, all the necessary pieces are then in place as far as motion goes, for real-time 3D. And it's here, at the point that the camera action is crafted over the scene, that the real magic of the format of MGS1 is really clear to see. As assistant director Yoshikazu Matsuhana said in a 1998 interview, quote, MGS is not like a static cartoon where it has to follow a set path, though we did use storyboards. The polygon world actually exists, and we can freely move the camera to look wherever we want. We often create better scenes than the ones we first envisioned." End quote. Two games debuted in 1996 that nearly beat Kojima's 3D concept to the punch. Biohazard, aka Resident Evil, and Tomb Raider put full real-time 3D on the PlayStation well ahead of KCE Japan's game. Even worse, while those games were becoming smash hits across the world, Kojima's team were only just completing work on their custom development tools for MGS1, and in the process, they've run into another major problem. Animating polygonal motion in 3D, as well as environmental interactions, well, it's proving especially troublesome. The LEGO stage models provided a skeleton for a game that would need to be highly detailed in environments. The team decided against the so-called Doom-style camera system because of how these early first-person shooters made turning and moving separate tasks, and also because they happened to give Hideo Kojima motion sickness. And a 3D dungeon crawler camera style didn't fit either. MGS1 had to be an action game, which responded and reacted to player input in real time. Speed also played a factor in the rejection of a first-person shooter camera and controls, as well as the rejection of its 3D analog, which is sometimes called the tank control schematic, that can be found in survival horror games like Resident Evil. None of these game types fit KCE Japan's vision, and no other models existed. So, once more, the impossible or purely hypothetical would have to become reality. A completely new kind of game design model would have to come into existence, one that would pioneer a new approach to 3D camera systems in third-person action games. But that could only happen once the initial plan to give MGS a top-down perspective was given some more thought. According to the game's assistant director Matsuhana, quote, "From the very beginning we had to spend a lot of time considering the camera system. We did a lot of experimentation with the operation of the camera's viewpoints while developing the game." End quote. The quandary for them was how to keep the fast responsiveness of moving in top-down mode, while also freeing up the camera from that static single shot that was so signature of yesterday's 2D. The solution came thanks to an as of yet unmentioned, but nonetheless integral, influence: Sony Computer Entertainment. SCE, in Kojima's words, quote, "changed the game business greatly by treating those of us who made games as creators," end quote. This meant not only that game designers for SCE enjoyed higher press profiles and more attention, more importantly, they gained access to the considerable resources, connections, equipment, and expertise of Sony Corp itself, much in the same way that film productions and music producers had for decades. Once Sony built KCE Japan a custom-sized miniature digital camera, the 1/30th scale LEGO model sets could finally be explored in real physical space, and through camera angles other than top-down. But once the LEGO model shapes were built digitally to scale, the team realized that their set having one-to-one correlation with a completely polygon-generated space in virtual reality could actually be manipulated, reframed, and reshot in an infinite number of ways, and all without the trouble of reshooting anything or having to use multiple cameras. But dynamically snapping from one camera angle to another would occur intuitively and as a reaction to interacting or moving through environments. There was even first-person mode, but it inhibited motion because it was to be used mainly, instead, for observation. But the new camera system, taken in tandem with the LEGO-based environments, meant the design team now had a homework assignment. Consciously emphasizing environments over character models, being untried and unconventional, also had its price. If the model structures and machinery within Shadow Moses lacked the detail or the sufficient patina of realism, then sacrificing conventionally pretty visuals and pre-rendered CGI cutscenes wouldn't have been worth the effort. KCE Japan gambled on their dream that atmosphere and immersiveness and real-time 3D would ultimately win out. But achieving a sense of really being in the world of the game would take real-world expertise. To get it, KCE Japan hired someone with an unusual job description for their field. Motosada Mori joins the team as its military advisor during the development of MGS1. Beyond the job of briefing the studio on tactics and equipment, Mr. Mori is also given the role of arranging several key research trips for the team. Using his connections as a former SWAT instructor in America, Mr. Mori gets Kojima personal access to 3 real US military bases. Kojima's decision to work with Mr. Mori led to countless benefits for MGS1 and the entire series. But while a different developer might have gone overboard with realism and accuracy, Kojima realized that balance was key. MGS1, as a result, winds up perfectly where KCE Japan wanted it to be and needed it to be all along, at the interstice between reality and hyper-reality. MGS1 was very much focused on the future for the medium. Many of the game's innovations have become common practice today, 2 decades later. But unlike its peers, MGS1 is just as interested in the medium's past. Metal Gear Solid passes on the spirit and experimental creativity of Japanese game design from the 1980s. The game does this not by fulfilling trends and norms, but by revolting against them. Every game that conforms to the design and narrative norms that MGS1 helped pioneer in 1998 is actually failing to do what MGS1 set out to do. Because Metal Gear Solid was never meant to replace the establishment's norms with its own, it was meant to abolish the idea of any single standard, and abolish the idea of there only being one right way to interpret, design, or even enjoy video games. In short, MGS1 is not an invitation to conform. The game emphasizes the design philosophy that creation is just a way of expressing individuality. Metal Gear Solid calls on the player and on the industry at large precisely not to follow the herd, any herd. It implores us, most of all, to think unconventionally, and to do it for ourselves.
Snake, you're not using a stereo TV?
It can't be. A mono TV? Well, Colonel, there's nothing we can do about it.
I guess you're right. Snake, don't worry about it. There's more to being a good person than just having a stereo television. You can do it just the way you are.
Secondly, Metal Gear Solid passes on the visual language, the themes, the style, and the attitudes of American cinema from the 1970s. The game is largely a return to that decade's signature gritty style, as well as its politics, its many ambiguities, its paranoia, and most of all, abhorrence for the American military-industrial complex in the wake of Vietnam. But Hideo Kojima would have never made the Metal Gear franchise, not even back in 1987, if not for the status of Japan as the video game center of the universe following the early 80s. The entire games industry has changed under MGS1's influence, but for all the games that borrow or try to carry on its legacy, almost none of them reflect any deeper understanding of the will of MGS1's creators when they brought the game into existence.
We've got the most powerful weapon ever made. You going to fight the whole world? What's wrong with that? We can launch a nuclear warhead at any target on this planet.